Rain glazed the cobbled streets of London like dark glass, and the lamps along Grosvenor Square flickered against the evening mist as carriages rolled past with the muffled elegance of wealth. Within Whitmore House, velvet curtains framed tall windows, chandeliers shimmered with quiet dignity, and servants moved in careful silence through corridors scented faintly with beeswax and roses. It was a home built for appearances, every polished surface promising harmony, every gilded mirror reflecting the illusion of a perfect marriage. Lady Eleanor Whitmore had once believed in that illusion with the innocent devotion of a young bride. She had arrived in London 3 years earlier with hopeful eyes and a heart eager to belong, the daughter of a modest but respectable country baron who considered the match a triumph beyond measure. Lord Nathaniel Whitmore was handsome, eloquent, and widely admired, the kind of gentleman who could command a room with a single charming remark. Society adored him. Mothers praised him. Young ladies whispered about him behind gloved fans. To Eleanor, however, he had once seemed something even greater. He had seemed kind. Now, as she stepped carefully from her carriage beneath the Whitmore townhouse portico, she pressed one gloved hand gently against the slight curve of her belly and wondered when that belief had begun to crumble. The evening air smelled of rain and lilac blossoms from the square's garden. Eleanor's bonnet caught the wind as the footman offered his arm, but she hardly noticed. Her mind lingered on the physician's reassuring voice earlier that afternoon. "The child is strong, Lady Whitmore. Quite strong indeed." A quiet warmth had filled her chest at those words. In a world where every conversation seemed shaped by politeness and performance, the certainty of that small life within her felt wonderfully real. She had spent the carriage ride home imagining Nathaniel's reaction when she told him the news. She pictured his smile, his pride, perhaps even tenderness. Yet as Eleanor crossed the threshold into the marble foyer, something about the house felt strangely altered. The usual murmur of servants was absent. The grand clock in the hall ticked with solemn patience, echoing faintly beneath the high ceiling. Even the fire in the drawing room seemed unusually subdued, its orange glow breathing slowly behind the grate. "His lordship returned earlier this evening," the butler said quietly as he took her cloak. "He is presently in the study." Eleanor nodded, her heart lifting slightly. The study was Nathaniel's refuge, a room of dark oak shelves and leather-bound volumes where he often retreated after social obligations. She had imagined finding him there tonight, perhaps reading beside the fire, unaware that his wife carried joyful news. But as she walked down the long corridor toward the study door, the hush of the house seemed to deepen. Then she heard voices. Nathaniel's voice first, low and measured. And another voice, soft, feminine, unmistakably familiar. Eleanor slowed without quite realizing it, her hand instinctively tightening against her abdomen. The study door stood slightly ajar, a narrow ribbon of warm light spilling across the carpeted hallway. She might have passed by. She might have knocked politely and entered as any proper wife would. Instead she paused. There was laughter inside the room, quiet but intimate, the sort of laughter that belonged not to strangers but to confidants. "Surely you do not believe she suspects anything," the woman said lightly. Eleanor felt her breath catch. The voice belonged to Lady Beatrice Langley. Beatrice had been her closest companion since arriving in London, a graceful, clever woman with quick wit and sympathetic smiles. They had shared countless teas, countless whispered conversations during long evenings at society gatherings. Beatrice had even stood beside Eleanor during the first months of her marriage, offering guidance through the labyrinth of London etiquette. Eleanor stepped closer to the door, confusion stirring uneasily within her chest. Nathaniel spoke again, his tone calm in a way that made Eleanor's stomach tighten. "My dear Beatrice," he said, "Eleanor suspects very little in general. It is one of her most predictable qualities." The word struck like a small cold blade. Inside the room, Beatrice's voice carried a trace of amusement. "Still, rumors must be handled carefully. Society adores scandal, but it can turn upon the storyteller if the tale grows too reckless." A pause followed. Then Nathaniel replied with a softness Eleanor had once believed reserved for her alone. "Which is precisely why the rumor must appear to originate elsewhere." Eleanor's heart began to beat faster, though she could not yet explain why. "What rumor?" Beatrice asked. Nathaniel exhaled slowly. "The question of the child." For a moment, Eleanor could not breathe. The hallway seemed to narrow around her, the carpet blurring slightly beneath her feet. "The child?" Beatrice repeated, curiosity sharpening her tone. "Yes," Nathaniel said. "When the baby arrives, London will already be whispering. Quietly, politely, but persistently." Another pause. Then Beatrice spoke with careful interest. You mean to suggest that the child may not be yours? Nathaniel did not hesitate. That suggestion will serve its purpose admirably. Eleanor felt the world tilt. Her hand slipped from her stomach, trembling. Inside the study, Beatrice laughed softly. You truly intend to ruin her reputation before the child is even born? Nathaniel's answer came without remorse. My dear Beatrice, society rarely questions a husband who appears wounded, especially if he suffers with dignity. And Lady Eleanor? Nathaniel's voice turned colder. She will endure the consequences of her own innocence. The words echoed through the dim corridor like a verdict. Eleanor stood perfectly still, every instinct urging her to flee yet leaving her rooted in place. She understood now with terrible clarity. The whispers that had begun circulating in drawing rooms over the past week were no accident. The curious glances, the hesitant smiles, the subtle distance that had appeared among her acquaintances, all of it had been planted deliberately. By the man she had married. By the friend she had trusted. Inside the study, Beatrice's voice softened again. And if she denies it? Nathaniel gave a quiet, almost amused reply. Who believes a woman once the rumor has been spoken aloud? Silence settled in the hallway, heavy and suffocating. Eleanor's pulse thundered in her ears, but she made no sound. Slowly, carefully, she stepped away from the door. The carpet swallowed the faint movement of her slippers as she retreated down the corridor, past the dim glow of the drawing-room fire, past the tall windows streaked with rain. When she reached the staircase, she paused only once. Her gaze drifted to the darkened study door at the far end of the hall. Then Lady Eleanor Whitmore lifted her chin, placed a steady hand over the life growing within her, and continued upstairs without a word. Because in that silent moment, something within her gentle heart had changed forever. Morning arrived over London with a pale, silvery light that slipped gently between the curtains of Whitmore House, touching the polished floors and quiet hallways with a calm that felt almost deliberate. The storm that had swept through the city the previous night had vanished entirely, leaving behind damp cobblestones, glistening rooftops, and a sky washed clean of clouds. To anyone looking upon the grand townhouse from Grosvenor Square, nothing about it suggested unrest. The house appeared serene, orderly, untouched by conflict. Inside, Lady Eleanor Whitmore sat beside the tall bedroom window, her posture composed, her hands folded lightly across the subtle curve of her stomach. The early sun softened the delicate gold of her hair, illuminating a face that London society had long admired for its gentle grace. Yet the quiet expression she wore now held a steadiness that had not been there the day before. She had not slept. The voices from the study had echoed in her thoughts through every hour of darkness, replaying with merciless clarity until the words themselves had lost their shock and settled instead into something colder, understanding. Her husband intended to destroy her reputation. Not through accusation alone, but through suggestion. The cruelest kind of scandal was always the quiet one, the kind that arrived in murmured conversations between ladies over tea, the kind that traveled faster than truth and lingered long after denial. Eleanor understood society well enough to recognize the elegance of the trap. Once a rumor took root, a woman's defense only nourished it. But as dawn crept across the rooftops of London, Eleanor also understood something Nathaniel had not anticipated. She was not as naive as he believed. A soft knock sounded at her door. "Enter," she said gently. Her maid stepped inside carrying a tray of tea, moving with the careful discretion expected within noble households. Eleanor thanked her politely, accepting the delicate porcelain cup, though she barely tasted the warm infusion. Her thoughts remained elsewhere. She had expected rage to consume her. Instead, she felt a strange clarity. For years she had moved through London society with the quiet patience of someone determined not to offend, not to misstep, not to disrupt the fragile harmony of appearances. Now that harmony had already been broken, and suddenly the rules felt less binding. By midday the rumors had begun to reach her ears directly. At first they arrived disguised as concern. During a brief carriage ride through Hyde Park, an acquaintance paused beside her window and asked after her health with unusual intensity. Later, at a milliner's shop, two ladies lowered their voices the moment Eleanor stepped through the door. The whispers were still delicate, still cautious, but they existed. Eleanor listened to them without flinching. That evening she dressed carefully for a small musical gathering hosted by the Harrows, one of London's most respected families. The event had been arranged weeks earlier, long before the scandal began to stir, and Eleanor saw no reason to decline. If anything, her presence would ensure the whispers grew louder. Her gown was a deep shade of emerald silk that flowed elegantly over her growing figure, the color chosen deliberately for its quiet boldness. The fabric shimmered softly beneath the warm glow of candlelight as she entered the Harrow residence, and for a moment the drawing room fell almost silent. Every eye turned toward her. Eleanor met their gazes calmly. Music resumed, conversation returned, and polite smiles were exchanged, yet the tension beneath those courtesies was unmistakable. She felt it in every lingering glance, every hesitant greeting. Across the room, she noticed Nathaniel speaking with a group of gentlemen, his expression perfectly composed. He inclined his head toward her with a courteous smile that revealed nothing of the conversation she had overheard the night before. To any observer, they appeared the image of a respectable couple. Only Eleanor understood the performance unfolding between them. As the evening progressed, she moved through the gathering with quiet dignity, answering questions, accepting compliments, never acknowledging the subtle shift in atmosphere. Her calmness unsettled several guests who had expected embarrassment or distress. Instead, she seemed almost serene. Near the end of the evening, however, a new presence entered the room that altered the balance entirely. The Duke of Ravenscroft arrived. Conversations faltered as he crossed the threshold, his tall figure commanding attention without effort. Alexander Ravenscroft was known throughout England for his wealth, influence, and formidable reserve. His dark coat and silver waistcoat were cut with impeccable precision, but it was the quiet authority in his posture that drew the most notice. He rarely attended small gatherings. When he did, people noticed. Eleanor had encountered the Duke only once before, at a distant cousin's wedding several years earlier. He had spoken little then, offering only a courteous nod before retreating into conversation with the bride's father. Now, as he surveyed the room, his gaze settled briefly upon her. It lingered longer than politeness required. Then he approached. The murmurs around the drawing room softened as the Duke stopped beside Eleanor's chair. "Lady Whitmore," he said, inclining his head slightly. His voice carried the calm weight of someone accustomed to being heard. Eleanor rose gracefully, meeting his eyes with composed curiosity. "Your Grace." For a moment neither of them spoke further. Then the Duke extended his hand. "In light of the music," he said quietly, "may I request the honor of a dance?" The invitation sent a subtle ripple through the room. It was unexpected and highly visible. Eleanor understood immediately what it meant. By choosing to dance with her, the Duke was placing himself within the orbit of the very scandal now whispering through London society. She studied his expression briefly. There was no mockery there, only calm deliberation. Eleanor placed her hand in his. The orchestra began a gentle waltz as they moved onto the polished floor, their steps slow and measured beneath the glow of crystal chandeliers. Around them, conversations resumed in cautious tones, yet she could feel the attention lingering upon them. The Duke guided her effortlessly through the dance before speaking again. "I find rumors rarely interest me," he said. Eleanor tilted her head slightly. "Yet they interest London immensely." "Indeed." His gaze remained steady. "Which is why I prefer to observe people rather than listen to stories about them." The waltz carried them past the long windows overlooking the dark garden outside. Eleanor considered his words carefully before replying. "And what have you observed, Your Grace?" A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. "That Lady Eleanor Whitmore appears remarkably untroubled by circumstances that would have undone many others." The music swelled softly around them. Eleanor met his gaze without hesitation. "Appearances can be misleading." "Precisely." The Duke paused before adding, his voice quieter now. "And I suspect yours are." For the first time since the previous evening, Eleanor felt the faintest spark of curiosity stir within her carefully controlled composure. Because in the Duke's measured tone there was something unexpected. Not judgment. Not gossip. Recognition. As the final notes of the waltz faded, he escorted her back toward the edge of the room, where Nathaniel now stood watching with an expression that had grown noticeably tense. The Duke released Eleanor's hand with formal courtesy. Then, before stepping away, he spoke one final sentence that only she could hear. "I believe, Lady Whitmore, that someone has attempted to place you in a very dangerous position." Eleanor's breath slowed, because in that moment she realized something that changed the game entirely. The Duke had not approached her out of curiosity. He had approached her because he already suspected the truth. And somewhere within London's glittering society, the quiet war surrounding her reputation had just gained a powerful new observer. The days following the Harrow gathering unfolded with the careful politeness of a society pretending not to stare. London's drawing rooms continued their rituals of tea and conversation, yet beneath every compliment lingered a sharpened curiosity. Lady Eleanor Whitmore moved through those spaces with composed grace, aware that each gesture she made was being measured, each word weighed for hidden meaning. The rumors had grown bolder. They no longer hovered delicately at the edge of conversation. They now glided openly through salons and supper tables, embroidered with new speculation by every retelling. Nathaniel, meanwhile, maintained the perfect mask of injured dignity. He accompanied Eleanor to dinners when necessary, his demeanor attentive yet restrained, as though he suffered quietly beneath a private disappointment he refused to discuss. It was a performance carefully crafted for society's approval, and Eleanor recognized the precision behind it. His restraint invited sympathy. His silence suggested pain. And pain, in a gentleman, was far easier for the world to believe than cruelty. Eleanor watched him across a breakfast table one morning, the sunlight catching the polished silver between them. Nathaniel unfolded his newspaper with calm deliberation, glancing briefly toward her with polite acknowledgement. "You seem well this morning," he remarked. "I am quite well," Eleanor replied. The exchange sounded harmless to any listening servant, yet beneath the civility lay a quiet awareness that neither of them addressed directly. Nathaniel believed he controlled the narrative unfolding around them. Eleanor allowed him to believe it. That afternoon she received an unexpected visitor. The footman announced the Duke of Ravenscroft with formal solemnity, and Eleanor felt a flicker of surprise before instructing that he be shown into the drawing-room. The autumn light filtered through tall windows as she entered moments later, finding the Duke standing beside the mantel with the composed stillness that had already become familiar. He inclined his head respectfully. "Lady Whitmore." "Your Grace," she replied. For a moment neither spoke. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, but deliberate, as though both recognized the unusual nature of the meeting. "I hope my visit does not cause inconvenience," the Duke said. "Not at all." His dark gaze rested briefly upon her before shifting toward the window overlooking the square. "London speaks frequently of you these days." Eleanor allowed herself a faint smile. "London speaks frequently of many things." "True," he said calmly, "but rarely with such eagerness." He turned toward her again, and the quiet intensity in his expression sharpened slightly. "I prefer understanding a situation before forming an opinion. And you believe my situation requires understanding?" "I believe," he replied, "that certain rumors are rarely spontaneous." Eleanor felt the air in the room shift subtly as those words settled between them. The Duke continued with measured clarity. "3 separate conversations have reached my ears within the past week suggesting that your husband privately doubts the legitimacy of your unborn child." The bluntness of the statement might have shocked another lady, yet Eleanor remained composed. "London does enjoy repeating delicate matters with remarkable efficiency." "Yes," the Duke agreed. "But it does not usually invent them without encouragement." He paused, watching her carefully. "You did not appear surprised when I mentioned danger at the Harrow gathering." Eleanor considered him quietly. "Your Grace observes more than most. Observation is useful. And what conclusion has your observation led you to?" For a moment he did not answer. Then he spoke with quiet certainty. "That you are not a woman easily destroyed by rumor." The words lingered between them. Eleanor's gaze softened slightly, though the composure in her posture never wavered. "You speak as though you admire that quality." "I respect it." The sincerity in his tone was unmistakable. Eleanor moved toward the window, her hand resting lightly against the polished wood of the frame as she looked out upon the square. Carriages passed beyond the iron gates, their wheels whispering across damp stone. Life continued outside these walls, indifferent to the battles of reputation unfolding within them. "Tell me, Your Grace," she said after a moment, "what do you believe my husband hopes to accomplish?" The Duke approached slowly, stopping a respectful distance away. "If society believes the child is not his," he said, "he may petition for separation while preserving his reputation as the wronged party." Eleanor nodded faintly. "A convenient arrangement." "Very." She turned toward him again, her expression thoughtful rather than distressed. "And if that narrative collapses? Then he risks becoming the architect of his own disgrace." The quiet certainty in his voice carried no hint of speculation. He spoke as a man accustomed to understanding consequences. Eleanor studied him carefully. "You appear unusually invested in a matter that does not concern you directly." The Duke's response came without hesitation. "I dislike injustice performed under the protection of politeness." The simplicity of the statement startled her more than any elaborate declaration might have. Silence returned to the room for several seconds. Finally Eleanor spoke again, her voice softer now. You are correct in one respect. The Duke waited. The rumors did not appear by accident. His gaze sharpened slightly. You know this with certainty. Yes. Yet you have not denied them publicly. Eleanor's lips curved into a small, thoughtful smile. Because denial would only strengthen them. The Duke regarded her with growing interest. And what will weaken them? Eleanor met his gaze fully. Truth. And you possess it? Not yet. The admission hung quietly between them. The Duke seemed to consider her answer carefully before speaking again. Then you intend to acquire it? I intend, Eleanor replied calmly, to allow certain people enough confidence to reveal themselves. He studied her expression with new understanding. You mean to let your husband continue? For a time. The Duke's faint smile returned, though this time it carried something closer to admiration. That is a dangerous strategy. So is underestimating one's opponent. Outside, a carriage rolled past the square gates, its wheels splashing lightly through a shallow puddle left by the previous night's rain. The sound faded slowly into the distance. The Duke's voice lowered slightly. If your husband succeeds, society will condemn you before you can defend yourself. Eleanor's hand drifted instinctively toward the gentle curve of her abdomen. Then I must ensure he does not succeed. Their eyes met again. For a long moment the room felt unusually still, as though both understood that the conversation had shifted from curiosity to quiet alliance. Finally the Duke inclined his head once more. Should you require assistance, he said evenly, I would consider it an honor to provide it. Eleanor did not answer immediately, because in that moment she realized something that altered the shape of the conflict surrounding her. Nathaniel believed he had orchestrated a private scandal. But he had overlooked one critical truth. Powerful men sometimes dislike cruelty. And the Duke of Ravenscroft had just offered to stand on her side. Winter settled slowly over London, frosting the iron gates of Grosvenor Square and cloaking the city in a pale hush that seemed to sharpen every whisper carried through drawing rooms and corridors. By December, the rumors surrounding Lady Eleanor Whitmore had ripened into something far more poisonous than speculation. What had once been murmured cautiously behind fans now traveled openly through salons, repeated with sympathetic sighs and carefully arranged pity. Nathaniel Whitmore had cultivated the scandal with remarkable patience. He never accused his wife directly. Instead, he allowed questions to linger in polite conversation, offering the restrained sorrow of a gentleman wounded too deeply to speak plainly. At dinners he appeared thoughtful and quiet. At gatherings he avoided Eleanor's gaze with dignified restraint, as though protecting himself from humiliation. Society admired such composure. And society believed him. Yet Eleanor continued her life with a calm that unsettled many observers. She attended the necessary engagements, received guests, and moved through each gathering with a poise so unshaken that it began to disturb the narrative forming around her. Women who had expected tears found instead a gentle serenity. Gentlemen who anticipated awkward avoidance were greeted with gracious smiles. It was not denial. It was patience. Nathaniel watched this with growing irritation. One evening in early January he returned home from White's Club to find Eleanor seated in the drawing room beside the fire, a book resting quietly in her lap. The room glowed softly with lamplight, the warmth of the hearth reflecting across polished wood and velvet upholstery. For a moment he stood in the doorway observing her. You appear remarkably comfortable, he said finally. Eleanor closed the book and lifted her gaze toward him. I am in my own home, she replied. Comfort seems appropriate. Nathaniel's lips tightened slightly. London speaks of little else but our situation. London often requires entertainment. He stepped further into the room, the deliberate calm in his movements barely concealing the tension beneath them. Most women would find such attention distressing. Most women, Eleanor said gently, might also find false rumors distressing. The remark hovered in the warm air between them. Nathaniel's eyes narrowed. You suggest the rumors are false. I suggest nothing, Eleanor replied quietly. I simply observe that they exist. The conversation ended there, yet the silence that followed felt charged with something new. Nathaniel believed the slow erosion of Eleanor's reputation had already begun to succeed. But Eleanor knew the moment of revelation was approaching. London's social calendar offered the perfect stage. The Ravenscroft Winter Ball. Held each year within the vast marble halls of the Duke's ancestral residence, the ball was among the most prestigious events of the season. Nobility, diplomats, financiers, and society's most influential families gathered beneath glittering chandeliers for a night of music and spectacle. More importantly, everyone attended, which meant everyone would witness whatever unfolded. On the evening of the ball, Whitmore House stirred with quiet preparation. Servants moved through candlelit rooms adjusting gowns and fastening jewelry while snow drifted softly outside the windows. Eleanor stood before the tall mirror in her chamber, studying her reflection. Her gown was ivory silk, its design simple yet elegant, flowing gently over the unmistakable curve of her pregnancy. Her hair was arranged in soft coils at the nape of her neck, adorned only with a small pearl comb. She looked neither defensive nor ashamed. She looked regal. When Nathaniel entered the carriage beside her, he regarded her appearance with faint curiosity. "You seem confident for a woman surrounded by speculation," he remarked. Eleanor's expression remained serene. "I find confidence easier than fear." The carriage rolled through the snowy streets toward Ravenscroft House, where music and laughter already drifted into the night air. Inside the grand ballroom, crystal chandeliers illuminated a sea of silk gowns and dark coats. Conversation flowed freely as guests exchanged greetings and observations beneath the glow of candlelight. When Eleanor and Nathaniel entered together, a ripple of awareness moved subtly through the crowd. Every person present knew the rumors. Every person wondered what might occur. Nathaniel greeted acquaintances politely while Eleanor accepted compliments with quiet grace. Yet the tension surrounding them grew steadily, like a string pulled tighter with each passing minute. Then the orchestra paused between dances. Nathaniel stepped forward. The room gradually fell silent as he addressed a small gathering near the center of the ballroom. His voice carried just far enough to draw attention without appearing theatrical. "I regret," he began solemnly, "that circumstances have forced me to confront a matter of great personal sorrow." Guests exchanged glances. Eleanor watched him calmly from a few steps away. Nathaniel continued with measured dignity. "A gentleman may endure many disappointments in life, but few wounds cut so deeply as doubt within one's own household." The implication spread through the ballroom like a spark touching dry leaves. Several ladies gasped softly. Nathaniel turned toward Eleanor, his expression heavy with carefully crafted grief. "I had hoped to protect my wife from public scrutiny," he said, "but recent developments leave me no choice." Before he could continue, Eleanor's voice rose gently but clearly. "You speak of developments, my lord?" The entire room turned toward her. Nathaniel hesitated. Eleanor stepped forward, her posture perfectly steady. "If we are discussing truth tonight," she said, "perhaps we should present it completely." A murmur rippled across the guests. Nathaniel forced a thin smile. "I assure you my intention is only to seek honesty. Then honesty shall serve us both." Eleanor reached calmly into the small reticule at her wrist and withdrew several folded letters. The sight of them caused Nathaniel's composure to falter for the first time. "These," Eleanor said softly, "were discovered among certain personal belongings." She unfolded the first letter slowly, allowing the silence of the ballroom to deepen. The handwriting was unmistakable. Nathaniel's. "And they appear," she continued gently, "to contain rather intimate correspondence between my husband and Lady Beatrice Langley." Shock moved visibly through the assembled guests. Nathaniel's face drained of color. Eleanor met his gaze calmly as she spoke the final words that shattered his careful deception. "It seems, my lord, that the only betrayal within this marriage was never mine." The silence that followed was absolute. Across the ballroom, the Duke of Ravenscroft stepped forward beside her. And in that moment, Nathaniel Whitmore realized his carefully constructed scandal had just become his own public ruin. The silence inside the Ravenscroft ballroom lingered like the breath before a storm. Hundreds of eyes moved between Lady Eleanor Whitmore and her husband, the glittering chandeliers casting long reflections across the polished marble floor. For years Nathaniel Whitmore had been admired for his composure, yet the letters trembling faintly in Eleanor's hand had stripped that composure bare before the most influential witnesses in London. The Duke of Ravenscroft stood beside her now, tall and immovable, his presence alone enough to shift the balance of the room. His dark gaze swept across the gathered guests with calm authority, as though silently reminding them that truth, once revealed, required acknowledgement. Nathaniel recovered first, though the recovery was fragile. "Letters?" he said stiffly, forcing a laugh that sounded brittle against the quiet. "Surely my wife does not intend to present fragments of private correspondence as entertainment for an entire ballroom." The remark drew uneasy murmurs from several gentlemen nearby, yet Eleanor remained perfectly still. "Private correspondence?" she repeated gently. "Yes, my lord. Private indeed." She unfolded another page, her movements slow and unhurried, allowing every guest the time to absorb the gravity of the moment. "I had wondered," she continued, her voice steady, Why Lady Beatrice Langley had grown so attentive to my household these past months. Why she appeared at our door with sudden enthusiasm for friendship, and why she so often sought private conversation with you. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. That is a malicious interpretation. Is it? Eleanor's calm gaze moved briefly across the crowd before returning to him. Perhaps your grace would be so kind as to confirm the handwriting. The Duke of Ravenscroft stepped forward slightly, accepting the letter Eleanor extended toward him. The faint rustle of silk gowns accompanied the movement as the surrounding guests leaned closer. He examined the page with quiet deliberation. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly across the ballroom. The handwriting is unmistakably Lord Whitmore's. The effect was immediate. Whispers erupted like sudden wind through leaves. Ladies exchanged startled glances while several gentlemen shifted uncomfortably, aware that the scandal they had expected to witness had turned sharply in another direction. Nathaniel's expression darkened. You presume too much, Ravenscroft. I state what I observe, the Duke replied evenly. Eleanor watched Nathaniel carefully, seeing the first true crack in the confidence he had worn for weeks. For the first time since the rumors began, he no longer appeared certain of his audience. Read it, someone murmured quietly from the edge of the crowd. The request traveled quickly through the room. Eleanor obliged. She lifted the letter and read aloud the lines that Nathaniel had once written in careless secrecy. Lines promising affection to Beatrice, lines mocking Eleanor's trusting nature, lines revealing the deliberate plan to let whispers of illegitimacy surround the unborn child. With each sentence the air inside the ballroom grew heavier. When she finished, silence returned again, deeper than before. Nathaniel stared at her as though seeing a stranger. You would humiliate your husband publicly, he said coldly. Eleanor lowered the letter slowly. No, she answered. You accomplished that yourself. The words settled through the crowd like a verdict. Across the room, a pair of elderly matrons exchanged shocked whispers while several younger ladies regarded Eleanor with something closer to admiration than pity. Society could forgive ambition, but cruelty toward a pregnant wife carried a stain even London's most practiced gossip could not polish away. Nathaniel's voice rose slightly. You expect them to believe this performance proves your innocence? Eleanor met his gaze without hesitation. I expect them to recognize deceit when it stands plainly before them. For a long moment neither spoke. Then the Duke of Ravenscroft addressed the room. It would appear, he said calmly, that Lord Whitmore's concerns regarding his wife's fidelity were not born of evidence, but rather of strategy. The remark carried quiet authority, and the crowd understood its implication immediately. Nathaniel had not been wronged. He had been scheming. A ripple of disapproval moved visibly through the guests. Several gentlemen turned away from him altogether, while a cluster of ladies whispered behind gloved hands. The carefully constructed narrative Nathaniel had nurtured for weeks collapsed in a matter of seconds. His gaze darted across the room, searching for support that no longer existed. You forget yourself, he snapped toward the Duke. On the contrary, Ravenscroft replied. I remember precisely where I stand. Eleanor watched the exchange with calm clarity. The humiliation she had feared weeks earlier had transformed into something entirely different. She no longer felt cornered. She felt free. Nathaniel's voice hardened. This farce proves nothing about the child. The remark struck the room like a final desperate throw. Eleanor felt a small movement within her abdomen, the child shifting gently as though reminding her of the life at stake. She lifted her chin. The child, she said quietly, will prove himself in time. Nathaniel's expression twisted. And if he does not? Then, Eleanor replied, you may attempt another lie. The answer was delivered so serenely that several guests gasped softly. For the first time, Nathaniel seemed to understand that the woman standing before him was no longer the trusting bride he had once manipulated. She had listened. She had waited. And she had chosen her moment perfectly. The Duke of Ravenscroft stepped forward once more, his tone calm but unmistakably final. I believe the evening's entertainment has reached its conclusion. No one challenged the statement. In London society, a duke's judgment often carried the weight of law. Nathaniel's shoulders stiffened, yet he could feel the shift in the room around him. Where admiration had once followed him, there was now only cool distance. The whispers had turned. Eleanor folded the letters carefully and placed them back into her reticule. Her hands did not tremble. She looked at Nathaniel one final time. I wish you well, my lord, she said softly. The words were not cruel. They were simply finished. Without waiting for his response, she turned toward the ballroom doors. Guests parted instinctively as she passed, their expressions a mixture of astonishment and respect. Outside, snow drifted gently across the Ravenscroft courtyard, the night air crisp and quiet after the intensity within. Eleanor paused at the top of the marble steps, drawing a slow breath. Behind her, footsteps approached. The Duke of Ravenscroft joined her beneath the lantern light, his presence calm and steady. "You handled that with remarkable restraint," he said. Eleanor glanced toward the falling snow. Anger would have satisfied him. And revenge? She considered the question briefly. Truth was sufficient. For a moment they stood in silence, watching the white flakes gather along the carriage path. "London will speak of this for months," the Duke remarked. "It always does." "And you?" Eleanor rested her hand lightly against her abdomen. "I will continue." Ravenscroft studied her thoughtfully. "Most people," he said quietly, "would have sought protection after such betrayal. Protection can resemble a cage." A faint smile touched his expression. "You are an unusual woman, Lady Whitmore." "Perhaps." A carriage rolled forward to the entrance, the driver holding the reins patiently as the horses exhaled pale clouds into the cold night air. Eleanor stepped toward it, but before entering she turned back toward the Duke. "You once said you prefer observing people rather than listening to rumors." "I did." "What do you observe now?" Ravenscroft regarded her for a long moment. "A woman who refused to be broken." The words lingered gently between them. Eleanor inclined her head. "Then your observation is correct." She stepped into the carriage, the door closing softly behind her. As the horses began moving through the snow-covered street, Eleanor watched the glowing lights of Ravenscroft House fade behind her. The scandal that had threatened to destroy her had ended instead with truth spoken before the entire city. Nathaniel Whitmore would spend the coming weeks defending himself against whispers he could no longer control. But Eleanor felt none of the bitterness she might once have expected. Because the greatest victory had not been humiliating her husband. It had been discovering the quiet strength he had never believed she possessed.